The air in May of 1945 smelled of victory. In London, it was champagne and rain. In New York, confetti and exhaust fumes. A war was over. A great evil was dead. For millions, it was the first morning of a new world. But in a quiet corner of America, inside a camp circled by barbed wire, the news of peace felt like a death sentence. The prisoners, thousands of German women, did not cheer. They wept. They panicked. They begged their American captors not to send them home. To understand this impossible choice, you have to see the world they came from and the gilded cage they found. If you believe history is found in the forgotten details, subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments what part of the world you're watching from. Let us call her Hannelore. She was 22, a nurse. For 2 years, her world had been the Eastern Front, a world that smelled of frostbite, gangrene, and cheap schnapps. Her reality was not the grand march of armies, but the small, terrible details. The sound of a boy screaming for his mother as she tried to stop the bleeding. The taste of ersatz coffee, brewed from burnt acorns, that was always cold. The sight of her own hands, chapped and red, scrubbing blood from a uniform that would be worn by another soldier tomorrow. The propaganda posters showed smiling heroes defending the fatherland. Hannelore only saw ghosts in waiting. When the Americans came, it was not with the roar of monsters she had been promised. It was with the tired crunch of boots on gravel. They were boys. Their faces were smudged with dirt and stubble, not malice. They chewed gum, a strange, rhythmic motion of the jaw that seemed impossibly calm. They looked just as exhausted as she was. Defeat was not a roaring fire. It was a quiet, hollow ache. The journey to America was a fever dream. Days spent in the dark belly of a ship, listening to the groan of the hull and the whispered fears of the other women. They would be sterilized. They would be sent to work camps in the desert. They would pay for the sins of their leaders. Fear was a constant companion, a cold presence in the gut. Then, land. They were put on a train. For hours, Hannelore stared out the window, and the first true shock of her captivity began. It was not a whip. It was not a cruel word. It was the landscape. She saw houses with whole roofs. She saw fences that were not topped with wire. She saw children playing in green yards. There were no columns of smoke on the horizon. There were no rubble fields where neighborhoods used to be. It was a nation untouched, a world away from the apocalypse she had left behind. The final stop was a place like Camp Hearn in Texas. The sun was a white hammer in the sky. The air was thick with the smell of dust and pine. The barbed wire looked just as she had imagined. But the guards were not the jackbooted thugs of her nightmares. They were older men, their uniforms a little loose, their expressions more bored than brutal. The processing was swift, a delousing shower that was shockingly, wonderfully hot, a set of simple, clean clothes. And then they were led to the mess hall. The smell hit her first. Frying bacon, real coffee. It was an aroma so foreign, so decadent, it felt like a hallucination. She was handed a metal tray. On it sat a pile of scrambled eggs, 2 strips of perfectly crisp bacon, a slice of bread so white and soft it looked like a cloud, and a small pat of yellow butter. She watched the others. They ate with a hesitant, animal desperation. Hannelore picked up the bread. She had not seen bread like this since she was a little girl. For years, it had been dark, dense stuff, cut with sawdust to make the flour last. This was weightless. She took a bite. It melted in her mouth. Then, the bacon. The salty, smoky crunch was an explosion of flavor. It was the taste of a world without rationing, a world without hunger. That night, Hannelore lay on a cot with a thin but clean mattress. Her stomach was full for the first time in 3 years. There were no air raid sirens. There was no artillery fire shaking the earth. There was only the sound of crickets and the quiet breathing of the women around her. She should have felt relief. She should have felt gratitude. Instead, a cold suspicion settled deep in her bones. This kindness was wrong. This food was a trick. The Americans were not the monsters she was told, but this clean, quiet, well-fed prison was more unsettling than any horror she could have imagined. Cruelty made sense. This did not. And she lay awake in the dark, wondering what the true cost of that slice of white bread would be. The days bled into one another, a rhythm of sunrises, roll calls, and simple work. They picked cotton under the vast Texas sky, or sorted vegetables in a cannery. The labor was honest. It was not punitive. Hannelore had seen Russian prisoners worked to death on the Eastern Front. This was different. This was just a job. The strangeness continued to pile up in small, baffling details. One day, at lunch, she saw a guard take 2 slices of the impossibly white bread and spread a thick brown paste between them. He ate it like a delicacy. The women whispered. What was it? Some form of punishment? A forced ration? Later, a younger guard, a boy from Ohio with kind eyes, offered her a spoonful on a cracker, peanut butter. The taste was alien. Thick, salty, slightly sweet. It was the taste of pure, unaccountable plenty, a food that existed for no reason other than pleasure. Then there was the music. Sometimes, a guard would bring a small radio to his post. Strange, chaotic music would spill out into the afternoon heat. It had no marching rhythm. It was all tangled notes, a saxophone wailing like a lonely animal, a trumpet that seemed to be making up the rules as it went along. Jazz. It sounded like freedom. It sounded like chaos. It sounded like everything their ordered, rigid world was not. They were given chocolate bars, not the waxy, bitter squares from home, but rich, sweet milk chocolate that melted on the tongue. They were given bottles of Coca-Cola, the cold, sweet fizz, a shock to the system. Each sip was a tiny explosion of a culture they could not comprehend. American industrial power was not just in its tanks and planes. It was in its ability to produce millions of these useless, wonderful little luxuries while waging a world war. A 1944 Red Cross report confirmed it. The caloric intake for a German prisoner in an American camp was often over 3,000 calories a day. Back home in Hamburg, the official civilian ration had fallen below 1,000. The prisoners were eating better than their own families. They were eating better than the guards in their own concentration camps. If you find the ironies of history are what truly tell the story, take a moment to subscribe. What you think you know is often just the beginning of the truth. The real war for Hannelore was now fought in the silence between meals. It was a war of loyalty. Every bite of food felt like a small betrayal. Every moment of safety felt like an abandonment of her people. She would watch the American guards play their strange game, baseball. A game of long pauses, of spitting and waiting. A game for a country with time to spare. How could she reconcile this leisurely, well-fed world with the one she had left behind? The propaganda had been a lie, but was this reality any less disorienting? Then the letters started to arrive, thin, heavily censored envelopes that had crossed an ocean and a war. Hannelores' hands trembled as she opened the first one from her mother. The black ink of the American censors had crossed out whole paragraphs. But what remained was enough. Hamburg, gone. The port, the neighborhood, the apartment, all of it erased by fire in a single night. Her brother was missing, last seen near Stalingrad. Her mother was living in a cellar, sharing boiled potatoes with 2 other families. The letter ended with a desperate, simple sentence. We are always hungry. Hannelore folded the paper. She looked out through the barbed wire at the green Texas landscape. In her stomach was a lunch of beef stew, white bread, and canned peaches. The guilt was a physical sickness. It rose in her throat, hot and bitter. The final blow came not in a letter, but on a screen. The camp commandants began a program of what they called re-education. One evening, all the women were gathered in a large hall. A film projector whirred to life. There was no Hollywood movie this time. The film was silent, jerky, and black and white. It showed the liberation of a camp called Bergen-Belsen. Hannelore watched. She, a nurse who had fought to save the lives of German soldiers, saw things that her mind refused to process. Mountains of human bodies, thin as skeletons, bulldozed into open pits, the faces of the survivors, with eyes that were black holes in their skulls. This, the film explained, was what they had been fighting for. This was the secret at the heart of the fatherland. The honor was a lie. The sacrifice was a crime. The entire world she had believed in was built upon a foundation of ashes and bone. She felt nothing. And then she felt everything. A shame so profound it seemed to suck the air from the room. A week later, an American officer tacked a notice to the camp bulletin board. It was May 8, 1945. The war in Europe was over. The notice announced the beginning of the repatriation process. They were going home. A murmur went through the crowd of women. But it was not a sound of joy. It was a low, rising hum of pure terror. Hannelore looked at the barbed wire fence that had been her prison. Suddenly, it seemed like the only thing in the world holding back the tide of a reality she could not bear to face. Freedom had never sounded so much like a threat. The letters arrived like ghosts, thin, fragile paper that had traveled across a dead world. Hannelore recognized her mother's handwriting, but it was thinner now, spidery. The American censors had done their work. Thick black lines obliterated whole sections, leaving behind a skeleton of a message. But the bones were sharp enough to cut. Hamburg, gone. The port, the church where she was confirmed, the apartment with the blue shutters, all of it was ash. Her brother, last seen near Stalingrad, was a ghost himself now. The final sentence was not blacked out. It was the clearest part of the letter. We are always hungry. Hannelore folded the paper into a small, tight square. She held it in her fist. That afternoon, the camp served beef stew, thick with potatoes and carrots and pieces of real meat. It came with a side of canned peaches and sweet syrup. She ate every bite. The food was warm in her stomach. The letter was a block of ice in her heart. The contrast was a form of madness. To be a prisoner, safe and well-fed, while your family starved in the ruins of their freedom. The guilt was no longer a suspicion. It was a physical presence, a poison in her blood. She was not just a prisoner of the Americans. She was a traitor to her own family's suffering. But the Americans were not finished. They believed the women were not just prisoners of war, but prisoners of a lie. And they were determined to set them free from it, whether they wanted it or not. The camp commandants began a program. They called it re-education. One evening, after the meal, they were not shown a Hollywood movie. They were marched into a large hall where a projector clicked and whirred in the dark. The film that appeared on the makeshift screen was silent. It was jerky. It was black and white. It was a dispatch from the deepest circle of hell. The film had no story. It had no actors. It only had evidence. The camera moved without art through a place called Bergen-Belsen. It panned across mountains of human bodies, limbs tangled like dead branches. It showed bulldozers pushing the dead into open pits, the machines struggling with the sheer volume of the horror. It lingered on the faces of the survivors. They were not faces. They were skulls draped in skin. Their eyes were black holes, bottomless wells of a suffering the mind could not hold. Hannelore, the nurse who had seen death in every form, had never seen this. This was not war. This was a factory for turning people into smoke and memory. The propaganda had been a lie, yes, but this truth was infinitely worse. It did not liberate, it annihilated. If you believe that history is not just a record of events, but a battle over the truth itself, then join our community, subscribe, and help us uncover the stories that were meant to be forgotten. The film ended. The projector went silent. No one in the hall moved. The only sound was a single woman in the back row, retching softly into her hands. The shame in the room was a living thing. It was thick and suffocating. It was the shame of the deceived. But it was also the deeper, colder shame of the complicit. They had not known, but they had served those who did. Their uniforms, their work, their very lives had been small gears in this immense machine of death. The honor of the fatherland was a lie. The sacrifice of their soldiers was a lie. Everything was a lie, built on a foundation of bone. In the days that followed, a quiet hysteria gripped the camp. Some women stopped eating. They would sit before their full trays, staring into nothing, until a guard gently took the food away. Others wept for hours without stopping, a low, animal sound of pure grief. One woman tried to hang herself with a bedsheet before being cut down. The American guards, once bored and relaxed, were now watchful. Their kindness mixed with a new, clinical pity. They were no longer guarding prisoners. They were guarding broken souls. Hannelore felt nothing. A vast, empty space had opened up inside her where her country used to be. Survival was no longer an act of defiance. It was just a state of being. You breathe, you eat, you wait for the next blow to fall. It fell on a sunny afternoon in early May. An American officer, the same one who organized the film screening, walked to the central bulletin board. He tacked up a single sheet of paper. The women drifted towards it, slowly, as if afraid of what it might say. Hannelore read the typed words, May 8, 1945. The war in Europe is over. All hostilities have ceased. The process of repatriation will begin immediately. They were going home. A murmur spread through the crowd. It was not a cheer. It was not a sigh of relief. It was a low, rising sound of absolute terror. Women began to cry, but these were not the tears of grief. They were tears of panic. They grabbed each other's arms. They looked wildly around, as if the ground were about to open up and swallow them. Hannelore stepped back from the board. She looked past the women, past the barracks, to the edge of the camp. She looked at the fence, the tall wooden posts, the neat, sharp lines of barbed wire glinting in the Texas sun. For a year, that fence had been the symbol of everything she had lost. Her freedom, her country, her future. But now, in the face of a peace more terrifying than any war, the fence looked different. It no longer looked like a cage. It looked like a shield. So when that notice went up on the bulletin board, the word home did not mean comfort. It did not mean family. Home meant returning to a continent of ashes, to a nation now synonymous with atrocity. Home meant starvation. Official reports from 1946 show the average German civilian was subsisting on less than 1,000 calories a day, while the prisoners had been receiving 3 times that. Home meant facing the vengeance of the Soviets in the East, or the cold, bitter judgment of a world that now saw every German as a monster. Home meant confronting the ghosts of their own complicity in a land of ghosts. And so they begged. The official reports are clinical, but the diaries and letters from camp guards tell the human story. They describe women falling to their knees. A former Luftwaffe communications officer, fluent in English, pleading with the camp commandant. "Sir, there is nothing for us there. My city is dust. My family is gone. Please, we will work in the fields for food. We will clean your barracks. Do not send us back to that." It was the ultimate paradox. The enemy had shown them a mercy their own homeland could no longer provide. The barbed wire, once a symbol of their captivity, now felt like a protective embrace, holding the horrors of the outside world at bay. Here, in this Texas prison, there was order, there was food, there was the shocking, unbelievable luxury of safety. Back home, there was nothing but the chaos of survival. Of course they had to go back. The Geneva Convention was clear. The war was over. And so they were shipped back to a broken Germany, to become the Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women, who would spend the next decade clearing the ruins of their cities with their bare hands. They boarded the ships in silence. Hannelore clutched a small bag. Inside, a wrapper from an American chocolate bar, a worthless piece of paper that represented a world she had only been allowed to glimpse through a wire fence. They traded 3 simple hot meals a day for queues at soup kitchens. They traded clean barracks for bombed-out cellars. They traded the strange, unexpected kindness of their captors for the cold, hard reality of life in a land that had lost its soul. Their story is a footnote in the grand history of the Second World War, but it is a powerful reminder that sometimes the greatest shock is not the brutality of an enemy, but their mercy, and that for a fleeting, desperate moment, the prison can become the only sanctuary left in the world. If this story changed the way you see the past, please like this video and subscribe for more forgotten histories. Tell us in the comments, what was the most shocking detail for you?